Philip Oldenburg is a professor of political science at Columbia University. Saturday evening in Pakistan, President Pervez Musharraf declared a state of emergency. As we discuss this Saturday evening Pakistan time, events are still unfolding, but I think we know enough to try and discuss what's happening there, what it means to the US, what it means to Pakistan. State of emergency, it's basically a suspension of the Constitution?
Yeah, it's a suspension of the state of the Constitution. There's what General Musharraf has issued, what is called a provisional constitutional order. It's not the first time that such an order has been introduced. It typically would be ratified by, he says the Constitution is in abeyance, whatever that means. In effect, it's martial law, because when the Supreme Court met to declare this declaration of emergency unconstitutional, General Musharraf basically dispensed with the Supreme Court, or those members of the Supreme Court who were not prepared to agree.
Why is he doing this?
It seems to me, from looking at the text of the declaration of the proclamation of emergency, which is almost entirely about or attacking Supreme Court or the judiciary for interfering in the war against terrorism in Pakistan, arguing that the Supreme Court had caused terrorists to be released and then they went off and committed more crimes and so forth. It suggests to me that that General Musharraf probably knew or was given to understand that the decision of the Supreme Court, which was expected in the next few days, on whether or not he had legally contested the election for a new presidential term, whether that was going to come out against him. And so
the issue is he's both the head of the army and the head of state, and there's question whether that's constitutional there.
That's another issue. He had said that if he were elected president, he would give up his position as chief of the army staff. And that dual office holding had been ratified by a parliament earlier, although that parliament was elected in a somewhat dubious election. But the real issue here was whether or not, as a serving officer, he could be eligible to run for president. That's part of what the argument was in the Supreme Court. And many people thought that this was clearly a violation of Pakistani law, and therefore he would not be eligible. And I suspect that's what he did. So that basically,
what would have happened though, if the Supreme Court ruled that way?
It depends. They might have said something like, well, this was an illegal election, but we'll wait for we won't disturb you in office until a new parliament is elected, and then you get yourself elected from that new parliament. In which case it'd be perfectly legal, by which time, of course, you would no longer be chief of the army staff, something like that. Or they could have simply said, this is illegal, you have no right, and you are now occupying, or when the term finishes, you will be occupying this in violation of order, and we'll have to have a new election.
Which would have been just November 15th?
Right, that's right.
So that's what he was afraid of, that they could have said, you need to leave in 2 weeks?
Right, and so this is in that sense a coup against the Supreme Court. And so, yeah, I think that's probably what he was afraid of. That's my guess, judging from that proclamation, that the Supreme Court had demonstrated a great deal of connection of legitimacy to the Pakistani people. The Chief Justice, when he had been dismissed, and then demonstrations were held, had proven himself to be very popular. And I think many Pakistanis were looking forward to a restoration of a legal order as opposed to this sort of catch-as-catch-can military order that's been Pakistan's mode of governance now for, well, virtually its entire existence.
Do you interpret this as Musharraf in the last throes of power, or reasserting himself after kind of a rocky few months, several months?
Whether he's in his last throes will depend on how the army thinks about this. If they see him as a liability now, that because he will have antagonized the international community, he will have provoked a substantial part of the Pakistan political elite, I don't think he's going to get the kind of support that perhaps he hopes. so that the army may decide that we need to have a new revamping of a constitutional order, start over again and so forth, but that Musharraf is not going to have any kind of legitimacy to do it, so let's get rid of him. That's not been the first time that that's happened in Pakistan history. So it wouldn't at all surprise me if that in a few days Mr. Musharraf was asked to proceed elsewhere.
By whom?
By the army. By the army.
Yeah. Well, he's the head of the army, so what?
Yeah, but the head of the army, you know, what can he do? It's the corps commanders who actually command troops, and they have typically been the people who have made or broken presidents and chief of the army staff. I mean, the chief, Yahya Khan, General Yahya Khan, who was chief of the army staff and chief martial law administrator and president in Pakistan in 1969 to 71, was asked to leave, and he left.
Do we have a sense of who would fill that vacuum?
No. I mean, it would be the army in Pakistan has always, all of the coups that have occurred from the top. That is to say, as it were, in order of seniority. So the likely new leader would be the current vice chief of the army staff, whom General Musharraf recently appointed to that position, who would be a loyalist of General Musharraf, but would be a different person.
Yeah. And do we know anything about him?
Not very much.
I
mean, he studied at Fort Leavenworth. Okay. He's got allegedly a more pro-American, or quite a pro-American position, but that's, I have no idea how significant that might be.
Because there is this concern in circles here that Musharraf, who is imperfect, is better than almost any other option from an American perspective.
Yeah, I mean,
do you share that idea?
I don't think so. I'm clearly I think a much better option would be to set Pakistan's system back on some sort of democratic trajectory, so that you could get truly popular support for what the government was doing. The government would not get popular support for supporting the United States the way it is doing. That is true.
Right.
But in the long run, it seems to me it might be better for both the U.S. and for Pakistan if that were to happen.
But there is a real short-term danger that the popular sentiment in Pakistan is not to support the U.S. and all the reasons we count on them.
Right. But I don't think that that's really an option. That's a hopeful. I mean, if you say what is the best path for Pakistan, that might be it. But in fact, the likely path is some sort of further military rule with different personnel. Some people worry that there are jihadists, there are extremists of some kind buried in the army, particularly in the intelligence agency and so on. I don't think that's true. All the information that I've ever heard suggests that anyone who would take over would be more or less like Musharraf. That group taking over would be unlikely, it seems to be, to immediately ask the U.S. to leave, for example, or to cut short all the agreements that we have with the Pakistanis right now.